Before we talk about what you were saying today about reducing incarceration rates for Indigenous youth, which I think is really important, I want to talk about Saturday's protests. You'd have to agree they were selfish and irresponsible, weren't they?
Well, they were in the fact that COVID-19 is highly infectious. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We have a potential for a second wave to sweep through. So we're not totally out of the woods, and part of what we worked hard to do is to keep Indigenous Australians out of the path of COVID-19, and it's worked. We only had 60 people identified with COVID-19 out of 800,000.
But they've ruined it for themselves, though.
In remote... Well, it's possible. We just have to wait and see. As I take the advice of the Chief Health Officer, our medical officers, isolate for 2 weeks, and if you show symptoms, go and get tested immediately because you will need treatment.
The Sydney organiser, Bassi, said there's no need to get tested, there's no need for people to quarantine who were protesting on Saturday because they appropriately social distanced. Would you agree with that?
Well, when you look at the images, not everybody was doing it, so you have a high risk factor, and there is somebody in that audience who could have been asymptomatic. In other words, they didn't show the symptoms, but they're a carrier, like the flu is. Some people have it mild, others have it so severe that they're hospitalised. That's why we can't take that line of reasoning.
There's so much anger out there after Saturday too, because so many people, business people in particular, who are slowly losing their livelihoods and, of course, their staff, have gone without. We've gone without in terms of weddings and funerals and birthday parties to abide by the laws. And now people are saying, well, hang on a minute, why is there a law for one section of the community and there's a different law for me?
And that's what's occurring in some of the messages I'm receiving, and certainly some of the anger being expressed, because there are people who couldn't attend funerals of family members or close friends. What we want, though, is people to listen to what the medical officers in each state and territory are saying and what the Chief Medical Officer from the Commonwealth is saying. Brendan Murphy is across what's happening in the globe, and he's conscious of the fact that we could have a second wave, and we don't want to open the door to that because restrictions will continue. We're getting the freedoms that we want to be able to do some of the things that we've always done. If we take a backward step, then governments are going to have to implement the regimes they had to prevent the spread of coronavirus in Australia.
Would it not have helped if someone like the Indigenous Affairs Minister had said something on Friday?
It wouldn't have made any difference. People who were organising all of the events were determined. And the issue is the passion on the issues that people protested about have been festering, but don't put your lives at risk. Don't put the lives of people who are vulnerable at risk. I saw a number of people wearing masks, but not everybody.
Can I talk about the issue then? You've raised what the issues were about. In relation to George Floyd, there's a chasm between the historic issues of racial division in the United States and the over-representation of black people dying at the hands of police, as opposed to what goes on here in Australia. And as you know, the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in 2011 found that Aboriginal people do not die at a greater rate than non-Aboriginal people in custody. Now, any death in custody needs to be investigated and we should try and stop it from happening again. But given that disparity between the two issues, what was it all about?
Well, I think we've got to focus on Australia. We have to focus on the incarceration rates, which are disproportionate. In my own home state of WA, incarceration rates for youth are appalling. The incarceration rates of women who default on fine payments is appalling as well. We've got to look at other mechanisms and other steps. And I've been rereading the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody and want to revisit some of those elements, because I think the initial stages after the Royal Commission, there was a lot of action taken. But I think that what happens, and I see this anyway, you become complacent and eventually you allow slippages to start creeping back in. And that death in New South Wales was inappropriate, and the can't breathe was the similarities between the USA and Australia. But there are many other issues that we have to address that was in the underlying issues report, and hence that's why we have the Closing the Gap strategy.
I agree entirely about reducing the incarceration of Indigenous Australians, particularly Aboriginal youth. But most of the placards that I saw over the weekend were about Aborigines being badly treated by police and trying to draw that comparison to the George Floyd death. There really is no comparison. Yes, Indigenous kids are over-policed, possibly, but that may be because they are also over-represented in crime as young people. But to try and draw the connection between the Australian context and the death of George Floyd was an overreach, surely.
Now, there are instances such as Miss Jew, who was ill in a prison cell, asked to be taken to a hospital, and on the advice of the police, she wasn't triaged, taken back again, and then ultimately taken back for a final time. And the footage showed the two police officers picking her up and then dropping her while they were carrying her. Now, this woman was in severe pain. She had what was sepsis or septicemia, and she ultimately died from that. So you get the culmination of these individual events, and then people ask the question, why was that allowed to happen and why wasn't there something done? It's like the elder from the Nunnajarra land who was brought in to Kalgoorlie in the back of a prison van. He fundamentally cooked in there because of the heat and the lack of air conditioning, and nothing happened to those individuals. So when you see events like that and there are deaths and nothing happens, then it's understandable to have that anger at the frustration of a system that was supposed to be fixed after the Royal Commission, but we still have these incidents occurring.
They're certainly overrepresented in terms of incarceration. How do we reduce the rates of incarceration, and do we have to not look within as well as without the Indigenous community?
We have to do both. We have to look at some of those issues that evolve within, but we also have to look at the interaction between police. I've been in areas where there have been plenty of youth and an event, but the police always make their way to the Indigenous kids who seem to capture their attention. Now, in some instances, they've been doing nothing wrong at all. They've just been laughing and joking. So there is a mindset that we have to deal with as a country, but nevertheless, it takes both parties to come together to look at resolving the issues, as we did after the Royal Commission when we established Aboriginal Justice Committees in each state and territory. And they started to look at the solutions arising from the problems that were identified in the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody.
One last one before we let you go. What do you make about this survey that says that 3 out of 5 Australians hold a racist view of some sort on Aboriginal people? Do you believe that kind of data?
Look, I haven't seen evidence of it, and I'm saying this not in the role that I'm in, but in the role of my interaction with fellow Australians over a long period of time. I have people who've got some strong views on issues, but I would not classify them as racist. There are people who do have and do demonstrate very racist views, and I only have to look at my tweets and some of my commentary that comes in via email, and they are blatant, but that's only a handful. Yeah,
not 3 out of 5 Australians, surely.
No, I don't see that at all.
I appreciate your time this evening.
What I'd like to do, now, Chris, just on that, I'd love to see the methodology, how many people, and what were the questions?
Yes, questions can elicit certain responses, as you know only too well. Thank you very much for your time this evening.
Pleasure.